Hi, welcome everyone. In this video, we're going to begin discussing our next philosopher, and I should probably also say sociologist, W.E.B. Du Bois. And I'm going to talk a little bit about who Du Bois was to get us oriented, and then we will begin exploring chapters 1 and 2 of this book, The Souls of Black Folk, great classic of American sociology. Okay, I don't really mean to be obscuring Du Bois's photograph here, but here's Du Bois. Just a little bit of biography. He is born in Massachusetts in 1868 and lives a very full, long life to 1963 with many events and many contributions to the fields of sociology and history. Um, Du Bois is famously not just a thinker, not just a philosopher or sociologist, but also a very prominent civil rights activist. He plays a pretty key role, I guess, in the early foundation or forming of the NAACP, and certainly would have played a very important role in the build-up to the March on Washington. I believe he dies right before Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. So there's a long kind of continuity of activism in the figure of Du Bois. He is brought up in a fairly comfortable middle class home in Massachusetts. Um, from what I gather, does not experience the kind of bitter, overt, violent racism that one would certainly in the South. However, there are complexities to his identity as a black man, obviously, and he will do an amazing job of unpacking some of those complexities. He's a very talented student, and you can pick up some details in the book regarding his academic achievements as well as athletic achievements. He seems to be just an incredibly hardworking and gifted individual. So through scholarships, he's able to attend Fisk University, which is historically all black college. He then does graduate level work at Harvard, and I believe becomes the first African American to receive a PhD from Harvard in sociology. So truly a trailblazing figure. This should say 1903. 1903 is the publication of Souls of Black Folk, perhaps his most well-known work, and certainly the book that would put him on the map as one of the great classic authors of the century. During this time, he is also involved deeply in activism and is a prominent leader of the Niagara movement, something of a precursor to the NAACP. And then he spent a lot of his life, his later work, working on this massive study, the Black Reconstruction in America, which is kind of the definitive, the seminal text on the topic of Reconstruction. And from my understanding, Du Bois, because he was able to live a long life, was able to keep revising and updating, and as new data and historiographical information presented itself, he continued to expand the work. So it really is a massive treatment. I encourage you all to read it as well. We're going to be looking at Souls of Black Folk, which is kind of a genre bending book that you'll notice there's this amazing blend of registers. The book sort of navigates stream of consciousness, autobiography, poetry, history, sociology, very fine grained criminology, everything seems to be a relevant resource for Du Bois as he unpacks the history of the period of emancipation, essentially. And you'll notice that the beginning of chapter 1 um, begins, and the chapter is called "Of Our Spiritual Strivings." It begins with a poem by Arthur Symons, which reads, "O water, voice of my heart, crying in the sand, all night long crying with a mournful cry, as I lie and listen and cannot understand the voice of my heart in my side, or the voice of the sea. O water crying for rest, is it I? Is it I? All night long the water is crying to me. Unresting water there shall never be rest, till the last moon droop and the last tide fail, and the fire of the end begin to burn in the west. And the heart shall be weary and wonder and cry like the sea, all life long crying without avail, as the water all night long is crying to me. So we have a poem which speaks to the attitude or tone of mourning and tragedy that would have been pervasive in the Black experience in the period of Reconstruction. But then there is a bar of music from African spirituals. So Du Bois will constantly be drawing from these heterogeneous lineages as he tries to go about the business of finding some kind of perhaps redemption or reconciliation to what has been done. Um, Now, there's a couple of problems to sort of bear in mind when reading the book, and the book is very densely written and involves a lot of historical detail. So it's easy to get lost, to lose the forest for the trees, as it were. The main issue, historically speaking, is this question of emancipation in the post Civil War period, which Du Bois will spend a great deal of time of addressing and redressing in his attempts to come to some kind of terms of what it is the African American has to experience as a recently freed slave, right? There's this founding trauma, this founding tragedy and legacy that cannot simply be brushed away, and he will unpack specifically in chapters 2 and 3 the legacy of emancipation and Reconstruction. We have this issue right away from the first chapter of the question of Black identity, or the idea that a certain race, a certain person, because of a kind of arbitrary marker like a certain skin or a certain background, means that you are an intractable problem. Du Bois asks, what does it feel like to be a problem? In other words, why is it that I can't just be born an individual with an individual set of values and an individual set of projects? Why is it that I have to inherit this nationwide problem that has imposed so much suffering on me, right? So the question of the individual, the particular individual, as against the backdrop of a very collective tragedy, I think is front and center in the souls of Black folk. We then have the issue of how Blacks are to relate to a society that has so systematically marginalized them and dominated them. How is the Black individual to adapt to or become a citizen, a full participating member of democracy in the period of Reconstruction? Can that happen? Is the Black person to surrender entirely his or her identity to the culture? Is he to retain an autonomous level of identity that is separable somehow from the culture? Du Bois will be constantly confounding and frustrating our efforts to have a clean answer to this. Okay. So just to talk a little bit about Du Bois' intellectual traditions and the kinds of intellectual resources that he will draw from while unfolding the argument. And the book actually does not necessarily proceed as a systematic argument per se. It would not necessarily be legible to a mainstream philosopher as a systematic argument about the need for X, Y, and Z policy, right? It is more of an exploration of so many different conflicting antagonisms. Okay. And I love Du Bois for this, for his refusal to not only give easy answers to political questions, but also to not provide a very consistent or clear methodology, as it were. He finds methodologies of various sorts interesting and useful, but also limited and stunted in other areas. So the first tradition, as it's often been pointed out, that he is drawing from is the Greek tradition of paideia, of education and teaching. And he for sure sees himself as a fellow traveler of Socrates and the Socratic tradition of skepticism, the idea that to be a critical mind, to be a critical person, is to have critical consciousness, to have the ability to peer through the contradictions of actually existing society, right? So Du Bois is sort of, in a way, throughout the course of the Souls of Black Folk, giving us a sense of direction in the development of our own critical attention, our own ability to not hold on to our quiescence and passivity in the face of past injustices. So there is a strong Greek lineage of skepticism and Socratic wisdom, I think, that prevails in the text. And you'll notice that Du Bois will pretty frequently turn to education as the main political rejoinder to the phenomenon of slavery and disenfranchisement. Du Bois really will put the task of a truly robust and well-funded and rich site of education as the key to African American emancipation. All right, that is the privileged political institution, I believe, in Du Bois. Du Bois also, in large part, belongs to the Hebraic tradition and the Christian tradition, specifically insofar as that tradition is a tradition of memory and transmission, the transmission of a people in long suffering. So you'll notice plenty of biblical references in the text, and certainly Hebraic, a kind of Hebraic impulse towards finding continuity amongst a people that has experienced discontinuity, has kind of suffered this terrible split in time through the legacy of chattel slavery, right? So freedom for Du Bois has to come not through forgetting or an abolition of the past, but through a deep, deep sense of commitment to the retention and transmission of the past. So Du Bois always will be working as a historian, front and center. Okay, a couple of key concepts, and the book does not begin as an ordinary work of philosophy, certainly, in that you'll notice it begins with a very, one could say, subjective and personal accounting of his own standpoint, right? He does not sort of pretend to have a God's eye view onto the position of emancipation or reconstruction. Rather, the whole issue of reconstruction emerges from his own experience and his own point of view. So right away in the book, Du Bois gives us this concept of the veil, which he is now really remembered for. The idea of the veil is that due to the problem of race in America, the problem of the color line, um, all blacks have to, in a sense, live from behind this somewhat opaque, somewhat mysterious kind of surface that marginalizes them, and that all social relations are somewhat mediated through this kind of racing veil that puts people into one cap and excludes others from the mainstream. So the veil will be this very interesting sort of trope throughout the book, and it's been suggested that um, there's perhaps a biblical kind of connotation here, but also there is the sort of naturalistic connotation of the veil or the um, kind of membrane around a placenta, right? That something has been birthed that has a kind of a layer, a membrane to it that needs sorting out, all right? So we'll have to talk about this, but the veil for Du Bois in the first level of analysis means that there is a kind of internalization in mental life or in the self of the very real objective color line that is still existing in America. The veil is the sense that I live behind this kind of curtain or this wall that is excluding me from something, right? So, try to imagine for yourself what it would feel like to, in every waking moment of your life, live from behind this kind of obscuring, colored, racing process of identification and marginalization. All right, so that's the first sort of philosophical, but also sociological point. And Du Bois very famously writes, "Why did God make me an outcast and stranger in mine own house?" In other words, the circumstance of being an African American in the United States is a circumstance of alienation, right? It is a circumstance of not being allowed to fully fit into a people. There is this sense in which, even though the Civil War perhaps is over and there's some kind of level of political recognition in the 20th century, full freedom and full reconciliation of the past has not been accomplished yet. Okay, We then have the very closely related theme or concept of double consciousness. And Du Bois is well known for the idea of double consciousness in sociology today. And you can think of double consciousness in the first instance as a kind of self consciousness. We all have the experience on some level of self consciousness. Self consciousness means um, the phenomenon of seeing yourself through the eyes of another, right? The idea that I can never really truly authentically be myself. I am always adapting myself. I'm always modulating myself to what I take to be the judgment of another. And for Du Bois, that kind of self consciousness takes on a very pernicious and dramatic and often violent determination from behind the veil. In the circumstance of the color line, double consciousness is a raised double consciousness. I can never quite be comfortable in my own skin. I am a stranger in my own house. My own sense of self is constantly inflected by this kind of negative and perhaps threatening judgment from an outside. All right. So there's a really interesting attempt here by Du Bois to return to some key concepts in philosophy, in traditional epistemology. This idea that the self is um, is the foundation of one's own action and one's own sense of self. And here Du Bois is saying, actually, there's a divided self, a deeply divided self, at the heart of being raised, with the result that my identity is never a unity; it's actually a duality, at least. And that's, I think, why the book is called "The Souls of Black Folk," not "Soul of Black Folk." Right? There's a plurality of souls. There's a plurality of minds and a plurality of identities at the heart of the raised subject. Okay. Um, so the problem of Reconstruction is not just a political problem, and it's not just a concrete material problem, paying people back what they're owed or giving them access to education, though those are important practical considerations as well. There's this much deeper epistemological problem of selfhood and a sense of selfhood with dignity in a people in a within a nation that seems to still be carrying with it the legacy of marginalization and systemic racism. All right. So Du Bois in chapter one is largely addressing fellow African Americans, and it seems to be that it's written from the standpoint of a pretty well educated black man, directed towards others who might be fellow travelers in his tradition. And he argues that we're sort of stuck with a problem of double consciousness or a splitting of aims. In other words, is the road to freedom going to be a road of positing a kind of black identity against a white country in which a black identity is autonomously perhaps in opposition to American culture in the main? Or is there going to be a kind of surrendering and assimilation to the dominant culture as the road to freedom? So there's this kind of double self, double soul that seems to be at odds or to be existing in the mode of contradiction, right? And Du Bois kind of wonders in a very speculative register here whether or not this opposition can be overcome or transcended. Can the double self be merged into a truly authentic self that is, on the one hand, accepted and perhaps loved, but also has not attempted to um, eliminate or repress or simply abolish the legacy of the past, right? Can this be done? So there's a desire on the part of African Americans to overcome double consciousness and unite the self into the culture, and yet to do so might run the risk of abolishing the legacy and hence forgetting the lineage of slavery and every injustice associated with it. Okay, the desire to overcome double consciousness and unite the self is central to the souls of Black folk. He writes, the history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. He would not Africanize America, for America has too much to teach the world and Africa. So the answer to the overcoming of self-consciousness is not going to come through Africanizing America, because America itself has its own values that are worth sort of accommodating to. And in any case, that would not be politically very possible at this point of time. And yet, he would also argue that we should not simply Americanize, should not simply assimilate, should not simply kind of conform to the mainstream of prevailing American sentiment. Okay, so this back and forth, this strife, will be at kind of the root of Du Bois's thinking and his psychology. Okay, so to get a little bit into the history, Du Bois will do a great job, I think, of kind of excavating a lot of the details of how the period of Reconstruction after the Civil War unfolded, and he will argue that by and large, period of Reconstruction was a disappointment. It did not deliver substantive freedom for the recently freed slaves. All right, obviously, it is a step forward to abolish slavery, but true emancipation does not happen. We have, first of all, of course, the persistence of segregation in Jim Crow South. There's this new modality in which official slavery and official denial of citizenship continues. We have an incredible gap of income and wealth throughout the country, and he will detail much further in chapter 2 the ways in which that economic problem is not easily overcome structurally. We have the problem of opportunity. What do you do with this huge population that's been recently freed and has to now enter labor markets, right? And of course, that will be mediated by the problem of education. How do you educate the typical freed slave, right? Where's the infrastructure? Where's the support? So all of these issues are evidence to Du Bois's mind of unfreedom, of a prolongation of unfreedom within the post-Civil War period. There's more to be said about chapter 1. I just kind of encourage you to have a look at the manner in which the idea of double consciousness becomes a question of the intersection of race and class. Du Bois will make it a point to indicate that class is a problem in the United States. It's a deeply class divided society, but when one is experiencing exploitation at a class level and race oppression, the result is doubly oppressive. The result is doubly awful for the subject that experiences it. Okay. To move on a bit to chapter 2, here Du Bois will wear more the hat of that of an historian, and the chapter is called "Of the Dawn of Freedom." And here he returns a little bit to the details of the period of emancipation and post-Civil War Reconstruction. And I kind of ask you to think a little bit about what the title of the chapter means, "Of the Dawn of Freedom." It seems to indicate that freedom is not a one-off event. It's not a single point in time. Rather, it is a process. It is a long process of transformation and struggle. And indeed, he will argue pretty much that freedom itself was not a gift from the federal government. In fact, whatever scraps of freedom that had been won were won through very bitter struggle from Blacks and other abolitionists. Okay, and we're not there yet, is the point. So, a few problems that are framing the chapter. What is a nation? What does it mean to belong to a people? The United States people in particular, which is a very complex people because it is so diverse and has so many different traditions. We then have, of course, the political problem of post-Civil War Reconstruction. How do we deal with the recently freed slaves? How can this society possibly not only at a political and economic level incorporate this huge wave of people, but also redress morally the injustice and the founding sin, as it were, of America? And then we have this problem of the color line, which Du Bois will explore in so many different ways as it unfolds, both demographically, educationally, politically, right? He will tend to become critical of electoral politics as the be all end all, and the issue of suffrage as sort of a kind of red herring for political freedom. But just to look a little bit into the piece, Du Bois famously writes in the beginning of the chapter, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, in America and the islands of the sea. Um, so you notice here Du Bois is shifting the analysis to a global perspective, right? The color line is the central problem of the 20th century, and it is not just an American problem; it's a global problem that is taking on new dimensions. However, the focus of the Souls of Black Folk will be the uniquely American circumstance of this kind of post Civil War moment. Um, Now, I think Du Bois is quite good at thinking about the color line in relational terms. In other words, it's not attributable to one specific policy or one specific Supreme Court decision, right? The color line is this relational dynamic that can kind of reconstitute itself in shifting terms. We have the relation of former slave owners and the recently freed slaves as being perhaps the key relation to the color line. Du Bois will be really interested in the new dynamic between those who were uh, slave owners and those who were slaves in the post-war period, because as you can imagine, um, former slave owners will now have to sort of face this new reality that they are going to be very bitter towards, right? There's going to be this persistent attachment to the antebellum South, and the period will be, Du Bois will be careful to note, a period of resurging violence. Organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, of course, committing incredible acts of violence, all kinds of opposition from merchant capital, all kinds of exclusion from labor unions. So this was still a highly violent and highly insecure time. We then have a new governmental relation between the federal government and freed slaves, and it'll become a problem for the federal government to try to figure out what to do with these freed slaves, right? So I'll walk through a little bit some of the details about that history as Du Bois presents it here. And then we have kind of a class dynamic between uh, poor working whites, and freed slaves, who, for the former, the event of Reconstruction will be a difficult one, because as new laborers, new labor power enters the job market, you have a kind of a new level of competitiveness over wages, right? And so this becomes a bitter conflict for both the poorer workers and the newly freed slaves who are now wage laborers, right? So what kind of conflict is going to unfold at that level? Du Bois will have a look at. Okay, so just a few kind of big events that, for any student of American history, you sort of already know, but it's worth kind of recapping a few of these things here. Du Bois begins by looking at this huge layer of essentially fugitive slaves from the South into Virginia. And you have this kind of period of large scale enlistment of freed slaves or fugitive slaves into the Union. The South basically says you got to send the slaves back. They're our property, right? Du Bois is careful to note that they are akin to oxen, right? They're just chattel, they're just property. Um, and very interestingly, Lincoln in Congress declares that the slaves are contraband of war. They have been smuggled from enemy territory, i.e., they are things, right? They're property. But nevertheless, despite this objectification, Lincoln says we don't have to send the slaves back. This is contraband of war. We get to appropriate it. So the slaves stay in the Union. We have of course, the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, which proclaims 3.5 million slaves are free in the secessionist states. Um, Interestingly enough, Du Bois does not spend much time on the Emancipation Proclamation. You may notice he does not regard it as a substantive um, act of freedom, right? It's really is just a proclamation. It's really just good words spoken. There are all kinds of compromises built into the Emancipation Proclamation. It grants slaves still to the four loyal border states. It really is just a kind of nominal promise of freedom, if nothing else. It is not substantive freedom. So really, Du Bois just mentions the Emancipation Proclamation, but it is not treated as a crucial shift, although it is a step in the right direction. We then have, of course, in 1865, the 13th Amendment, which officially is the act of legislation abolishing slavery by Congress. Okay, so these are big picture historic events, but Du Bois is sort of setting them up in order to show that none of them adequately amounts to substantive freedom or emancipation. So he's going to fill in the details with fine-grained political economy and fine-grained historiography to try to show how, despite these steps forward, substantive freedom hasn't been delivered. As I mentioned before, the period of Reconstruction is characterized by deep instability, insecurity, and renewed violence. There's raids, there's the KKK, there's all kinds of discrimination, right? He writes, and the Negro knew full well that whatever their deeper convictions may have been, Southern men fought with desperate energy to perpetuate this slavery under which the Black masses, with half articulate thought, had writhed and shivered. So there is some careful consideration here from the standpoint of Southerners as recent, the recent losers of this bitter conflict, and dealing with all kinds of injury and loss of their own, now have to get real, as it were, about what post-Civil War life will be like for them. And as you can imagine, there's going to be a lot of resentment, bitterness, and humiliation from their part that will be kind of transferred over to the treatment of African Americans in this period, right? So it's still a very ripe wound, as it were, at this time. I think Du Bois, his genius really shines as a sociologist on the question of labor and property, and his fine-grained analyses of how challenging it would have been and how nearly impossible it would have been for previously existing labor markets in the United States to have simply made the transformation overnight to this huge population of freed slaves into the system of contract-based wage labor, right? How can the freed slaves immediately assimilate to labor markets already in operation with unions protecting certain layers of the labor force? How do you possibly solve this problem? And like I said before, Du Bois will really privilege education as the key to building a workforce capable of autonomous enterprise, basically, right? Du Bois doesn't think freed slaves have any shot of competing with previously existing labor forces simply by showing up to work. There needs training, to be training, support, infrastructure, funding from the federal level, right? So, on that note, you will perhaps observe that a lot of the chapter has to do with the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau, kind of a fascinating institution. The Freedmen's Bureau was perhaps it's perhaps less talked about as an element of this history, but it was essentially the government's solution to making the transition for freed slaves into civil society. And the Bureau was tasked with all kinds of services and was meant to provision raw materials to freed slaves, to clothe them, to feed them. There was supposed to be redistribution of abandoned lands from the war. The Freedmen's Bureau was supposed to sort of regulate labor contracts to make sure that slaves were actually getting fair contracts from firms. And Du Bois's indication is that the Bureau was kind of a mixed legacy. On the one hand, perhaps there were good intentions behind it, but it seemed to be staffed by a lot of officers who were not entirely too inclined to really make it work, right? There was a lot of just kind of fatigue and not fatigue, perhaps envy or bitterness on the part of those running the bureau. So it never really had the kind of energy and support that it needed with such an ambitious project to run. Oh, and I should say the Freedmen's Bureau, interestingly, was tasked with solemnizing marriages because during the period of slavery, slaves were not allowed to get married legally because they were not citizens. And so that was this kind of incredible direct act by the government of now stepping in to, in a sense, regulate family life. And then, of course, to expand and fund education was the central task. All right, and you'll pick up moments where Du Bois seems sympathetic to the bureau, and other times he will be very bitterly disappointed by its achievements. We then get very important and contrasting these stark images of the Reconstruction period that kind of summarize quite a bit his overall impression of the time. On page 25, there are two different figures he gives us. First, he writes thus: "It is doubly difficult to write of this period calmly. So intense was the feeling, so mighty the human passions that swayed and blinded men. Amid it all, two figures ever stand to typify that day to coming ages. The one, a gray haired gentleman whose fathers had quit themselves like men, whose sons lay in nameless graves, who bowed to the evil of slavery because its abolition threatened untold ill to all, who stood at last in the evening of life, a blighted, ruined form with hate in his eyes, and the other a form hovering dark and mother-like, her awful face black with the mists of centuries, and aforetime quailed at that white master's command, had bent in love over the cradles of his sons and daughters, had closed in death the sunken eyes of his wife." So the first image is this kind of former slaveholder, slave owner, now sort of having to face the reality of a post slavery world, and a former slave, a woman who has suffered or has kind of borne the burden of centuries of chattel slavery, now faced with a completely open horizon, but a very uncertain horizon. Okay, so one kind of synthesizing question, I hope, would be whether or not you think Du Bois feels the Reconstruction period was a failure in political terms, in economic terms. Try to think for yourself whether or not he believes this could be chalked up to uh, political ill will or the immorality of actors concerned, or does he believe it was largely a period of good intentions, but perhaps um, ill conceded? So that's chapter 1 and 2 of The Souls of Black Folk. We will move forward and have a look at subsequent analyses of Reconstruction, as well as his treatment um, of post Reconstruction life in chapter 9.